The morning sun cast long shadows across the training grounds of the Galactic Survival Academy, and Marcus Chung stood among 24 alien students who represented some of the most dangerous predator species known. Space Instructor Velkoth moved through the assembled group on 4 powerful arms, his chitinous body gleaming in the light as his compound eyes examined each student with the intensity of someone who had survived 8 decades of the most hostile environments the galaxy could offer. Your final examination begins in 3 days, Velkoth announced, his voice carrying across the silent courtyard through his translator unit. You will be dropped into the Crimson Barrens with only basic survival equipment: a knife, a water purifier, and an emergency beacon to be used only if you are dying. Marcus listened carefully while the students around him shifted with anticipation or anxiety depending on their species and temperament. The Varkesh students, massive, wolf-like beings with silver fur and 6 legs, seemed eager, their pack mentality making them confident in their hunting abilities. The lone Threnody student, a serpentine creature with heat-sensing pits and retractable fangs, remained motionless and cold like the ambush predator. She was bred to be. 3 Quilkson students clicked and chirped to each other in ultrasonic frequencies, their bat-like faces splitting into toothy grins as they discussed echolocation hunting strategies. Then there was Marcus, the only human in a class of apex predators from across the galaxy. Your mission is simple, Velkoth continued, pacing before them. Survive for 5 days and return with enough food to have sustained yourself through the trial, and you will pass. He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the group. The Crimson Barrens are not forgiving, he said, his voice taking on a harder edge. The prey there is scarce, fast, and clever, and the megafauna will see most of you as food rather than competition. Marcus noticed several students tensing at this information, but he remained calm and took mental notes. Many of you have natural advantages, Velkoth said, gesturing toward the Varkesh pack. Speed, strength, enhanced senses, venom. Natural weapons. These are the tools your species evolved over millions of years. The instructor's eyes settled on Marcus for a long moment, and there was something in that gazed out. Perhaps concern. Some of you, Velkoth continued without naming Marcus directly, will need to rely on other qualities to survive. The dismissal in his tone was clear enough that several alien students glanced at Marcus with what he interpreted as pity. Marcus had grown used to this reaction over his months at the academy, and he understood why his classmates viewed him as disadvantaged compared to them. He was slow, unable to match the Varkesh in a sprint or the Quilkson. In flight his senses were dull, no infrared vision like the Threnody, no echolocation like the Quilkson, no scent tracking like the Varkesh, had no natural weapons, no claws, no fangs, no venom, no armor on paper. Humans seemed entirely unsuited for survival in hostile environments. You will have access to terrain data and climate information, Velkoth said, moving toward a holographic display that sprang to life showing the harsh landscape of the Crimson Barrens. I suggest you use the next 3 days to prepare mentally and physically. The display showed a vast expanse of rust-colored rock formations, sparse vegetation, and scattered water sources. Marcus leaned forward slightly, studying the topography with intense focus. Questions? Velkoth asked. A Varkesh named Throck raised one massive paw. Can we hunt in packs, Instructor? You may use any strategy you wish, Velkoth replied. But remember, you each must return with enough food for yourself, and I will know if you relied entirely on others' kills without contributing. More questions came from various students, mostly about what types of prey to expect and what areas were forbidden due to extreme danger. Marcus waited until most had finished before raising his hand. Yes, human? Velkoth acknowledged him with what seemed like reluctance. Can we access botanical surveys of the region? Marcus asked, and historical data on animal migration patterns and seasonal behaviors? Several students turned to look at him with confusion. Thruck snorted, a sound like grinding boulders. Why would you need plant data for a hunting exam? Marcus didn't answer, instead keeping his attention on Velkoth. Instructor's expression was unreadable. Such data is available in the Academy archives, though I confess I don't see its relevance to your survival. Thank you. Instructor, Marcus said. Simply Velkoth dismissed them, and the students dispersed toward the training facilities or their quarters. Marcus headed directly for the archives. As he walked, he overheard Throck talking to his packmates. The human will fail. He has no advantages. No natural hunting ability. Perhaps the instructors will rescue him when he activates his beacon on day 2. Another Varkesh replied. And they laughed, a sound like rocks tumbling down a mountain. The Threnody student, whose name was Silith, slithered past Marcus in the corridor. I do not wish to see you die. Human, she said, her voice sibilant and cold. Use your beacon early if you must. There is no shame in recognizing your limitations. Marcus nodded politely. I appreciate your concern. In the archives, Marcus spent the next 6 hours downloading data onto his personal tablet. Topographical maps showing elevation changes and water drainage patterns. Botanical surveys listing every plant species in the region and their flowering or fruiting seasons. Climate data showing temperature variations and wind patterns. And most importantly, animal behavior studies documenting feeding times, territorial ranges, and movement patterns. Other students were preparing by practicing their hunting techniques in the simulation rooms or conditioning their bodies for the harsh environment ahead. Marcus prepared by studying over the next 2 days, while Throck and his pack practiced coordinated pursuit tactics and Silith honed her strike speed on moving targets. Marcus sat in his quarters surrounded by maps and charts. He made notes in a physical journal-old-fashioned, even by human standards, but reliable and requiring no power source. He drew diagrams showing how water flowed through the terrain during the brief rain season, where animals would need to travel to reach water sources, which plants produced fruits or seeds that might attract herbivores, and where natural choke points existed in the landscape on the evening before departure. The students gathered for a final meal. Marcus sat alone, not out of rejection by the others, but because he was still reviewing his notes. Velkoth observed from the instructor's table, watching the human with an expression that mixed concern with curiosity. The ancient Krinter had trained thousands of students across dozens of species, and he prided himself on recognizing potential in all its forms. But he could not understand what advantage this human believed he possessed. Humans were new to the galactic community, barely a century since first contact, and their reputation was still being established. They had no remarkable physical traits, no specialized evolutionary advantages, nothing that suggested they should excel at survival in hostile environments. And yet, Velkoth thought as he watched Marcus sketch something in his journal, the human seemed unconcerned, even confident. Perhaps, Velkoth muttered to himself, he simply does not understand the danger. That night, Marcus slept soundly while many of his classmates tossed with nervous energy. Tomorrow, the real test would begin. The transport ship descended through the thin atmosphere of Kestru 7, and the students pressed against the viewports to see the crimson barrens spreading beneath them like an endless sea of rust and stone. Marcus sat calmly in his harness, eyes closed, mentally reviewing everything he had learned about the region over the past 3 days. The HFY ship touched down at 24 different locations across the barrens, depositing each student alone with their basic survival kit, a simple steel knife, a compact water purifier, and an emergency beacon clipped to their belts. When Marcus stepped onto the sun-baked rock of his designated zone, the transport lifted off immediately and disappeared into the pale sky, leaving him in profound silence. The heat hit him like a physical force, and the air smelled of minerals and dry vegetation. Marcus took a slow breath, centering himself, then began a methodical survey of his immediate surroundings, unlike the other students, who had immediately set off to begin hunting. Marcus walked in a wide circle around his drop point, moving slowly and observing everything, noted the angle of the sun, and oriented himself to the maps he had memorized to the north. A line of darker stone suggested ancient water channels to the east. Scattered patches of thorny shrubs clung to life in shallow depressions to the south. The land rose into broken ridges that would provide shade during the hottest hours. Marcus pulled out his knife and cut a straight branch from one of the thorn bushes, stripping it clean despite the scratches it left on his hands. Carved a notch at one end and stuck the branch upright in a crack between rocks, creating a primitive sundial that would help him track time and direction 20 kilometers away. Thrak and 2 other Varkesh were already pursuing prey there. Enhanced noses had picked up the scent of razor hairs, fast-moving herbivores about the size of a human child with powerful hind legs and sharp, defensive claws. The Varkesh pack moved with practiced coordination, using their 6 legs to navigate the rocky terrain at speeds that would have left a human far behind. They chased a small group of hares toward a box canyon, planning to trap them against the rocks. The hares dodged and weaved with desperate speed, their survival instincts honed by thousands of generations. One Varkesh lunged, jaws snapping closed on empty air as the hare leaped sideways at the last possible moment. Chase continued for nearly an hour before Thrak finally brought down a single hare, its body broken by his powerful jaws. The 3 Varkesh had expended enormous energy for perhaps 2 kilograms of meat. They would need to hunt again soon in a different zone. Silith the Threnody had found a watering hole and coiled herself among the rocks nearby. Her scales shifting color to match the stone, she remained absolutely motionless, her metabolism slowed to conserve energy. Her heat sensors focused on the approaches to the water hours. Past a small reptilian creature approached the water. Cautious but desperate for moisture, Resilith struck with blinding speed, her fangs sinking into the prey and injecting paralytic venom. It was a successful hunt, but the creature weighed less than a kilogram, barely enough for one meal. The Quilkson students had taken to the air, using their wings to survey large areas and their echolocation to detect prey hidden among the rocks. One spotted a colony of burrowing rodents and dove down. Claws extended, the rodents scattered into their tunnels at the last second, and the Quilkson crashed painfully into the hard ground, coming away with nothing but bruises. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his methodical exploration. He moved from his starting point to the ancient water channels, following them upstream until he found what he was looking for, a place where water still flowed during certain times of day. Fed by an underground spring, the ground around this water source was marked with tracks. Dozens of different species came here to drink. Marcus studied the tracks, identifying species by comparing them to images he had memorized, small hoofprints from herbivores, dragging marks from serpentine creatures, bird-like prints from avalanche. Noted which tracks were freshest and which directions they led from there. He began to map out game trails, the natural paths animals took between water, feeding areas, and shelter. These paths followed the lines of least resistance through the terrain, places where the rocks formed natural corridors or where vegetation grew thickest by mid-afternoon. Marcus had covered several kilometers, not hunting but observing and collecting materials. He gathered long, flexible branches from the thorn bushes, stripping them into thin strips that could serve as cordage. He collected straight sticks of various lengths and thicknesses. He found flat stones with sharp edges that could be used as tools or weights. Other students would have seen him as wasting precious time, burning energy without gaining any food. Marcus saw it differently. He was investing time now to create systems that would work for him later as the sun began to set, painting the crimson barrens in shades of deep orange and purple. The students settled into their first night, rocks pack, huddled together. Having caught 2 more small prey animals through the day at the cost of constant running and several injuries from sharp rocks, they had food for tonight. But tomorrow they would need to hunt again. Selith had caught nothing else after her morning kill, and her stomach cramped with hunger. She refused to move from her position, however. Determined that eventually prey would come to her, the Quilkson students roosted in crevices. Having caught only insects and 1 small bird between the 3 of them, they clicked nervously to each other. Discussing whether they had chosen the wrong hunting zones, Marcus made camp in a sheltered area near the water source. Using rocks to create a small windbreak, he had not caught any prey, had not even attempted to hunt in the traditional sense, but he had worked steadily through the day. And now he laid out the materials he had gathered using his knife. He began to carve and shape the sticks and stones into specific forms. He wove the flexible branch strips into cordage, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency by firelight created with his knife striking rocks to create sparks onto dry tinder. Marcus assembled his first trap. It was a simple snare made from a bent branch and a loop of cordage, designed to catch anything that walked down one of the game trails he had identified. He built it at a natural choke point, where tracks indicated animals passed regularly. The trigger was a delicate arrangement of twigs that would release the bent branch when disturbed. Pulling the snare loop tight, Marcus built 2 more snares along different trails before exhaustion forced him to stop. He ate a small portion of emergency rations from his kit, something he had been allowed to bring, and settled down to sleep. Above him, the stars of unknown constellations filled the sky across the barrens. Velkoth sat in the monitoring station, observing his students through orbital drones. He watched Throk's pack sleep fitfully, their bodies exhausted from constant running. He watched Silith maintaining her vigil by the waterhole. He watched the Quilkson students huddled together for warmth. Then he switched the view to Marcus's location and frowned. The Talende Yang human had caught nothing, yet he seemed unconcerned. The instructor zoomed in on the strange constructions Marcus had built near the game trails. "What are those?" Velkoth muttered to himself. He had never seen anything quite like them. They appeared to be some kind of mechanism, but for what purpose? Velkoth made a note to monitor the human closely tomorrow. If Marcus did not secure food soon, the instructor would need to intervene before the situation became dangerous. As dawn approached, bringing the second day of the trial, the students began to stir. Most were hungry, all were tired, and the real challenge was only beginning. Marcus woke before sunrise, drank water from his purifier, and set out to check his snares. He walked calmly through the gray pre-dawn light, moving quietly along the game trails. At the first snare location, he found nothing. At the second, the trap had been triggered, but the animal had escaped, pulling free before the snare tightened properly. Marcus made a mental note to adjust the trigger sensitivity. At the third location, a razor hair hung suspended in the snare. Already dead from struggling against the cordage, Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction as he retrieved his first catch. The trap had worked while he slept, requiring no energy expenditure on his part. He reset the snare and moved on, already planning where to build his next traps. The hunt had truly begun, but not in any way his classmates or instructor expected. Day 3 dawned with the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and dance above the rocks, and Marcus was already awake and moving through his trap lines before most of his classmates had opened their eyes. He had spent the previous day building more traps, not just snares, but different types suited to different prey and terrain near the water source. He had constructed a deadfall trap using a large flat stone balanced on carefully arranged trigger sticks. When An animal pushed against the bait stick to reach the water-soaked moss underneath. The stone would drop with enough force to kill instantly, along the stream that fed the water source. Marcus had built a simple fish weir, a funnel-shaped structure of woven sticks that allowed fish to swim in, but made it nearly impossible for them to find a narrow exit. He had studied the water and noticed small silver fish darting between rocks. And while they were individually small, a trap could catch many of them without any effort on his part. A grove of fruit-bearing bushes where he had seen abundant animal droppings. Marcus had set up box traps, simple wooden cages that dropped when an animal entered to eat the bait inside. The engineering was primitive but effective, using gravity and leverage to do the work now. On the morning of day 3, Marcus made his rounds. The first snare held another razor hair, plump and healthy. The second snare had caught something new, a spine rat, a rodent-like creature covered in defensive quills. Marcus approached carefully, killed it quickly with his knife, and removed it from the trap. The deadfall trap had triggered during the night, and beneath the stone he found a feathered drake, a bird-like creature about the size of a turkey that other students had spent hours chasing unsuccessfully. The fish weir held 7 silver fish, all still alive and swimming in the confined space. Marcus collected them. Pleased with the efficiency, the box traps had caught 2 more spine rats by mid-morning. Marcus had collected more food than he could eat in 3 days, made his way back to his camp, and began the process of preservation using his knife. He cleaned and butchered each animal with practiced efficiency, his movements economical and sure. He built a smoking rack from green wood that wouldn't burn quickly, and started a low fire beneath it, using the driest wood he could find. The smoke would preserve the meat for days, allowing him to build up a surplus. He also laid thin strips of meat on hot rocks to make jerky, another preservation method that required no refrigeration, as Marcus worked 20 kilometers away. Throke's hunting pack was having a very different experience. They had been running since dawn, chasing the same group of razor hares across the scorching rocks. The hares were learning their tactics, becoming harder to corner with each attempt. One of the Varkesh, named Grax, had torn his paw on sharp stones during a desperate lunge at prey. The injury wasn't serious enough to use his emergency beacon, but it slowed him down and made hunting even more difficult. Had caught 1 small animal since yesterday evening, barely enough to split between 3 large carnivores. Throck's stomach cramped with hunger, and he was beginning to understand that their strategy was unsustainable. They were burning more calories in their hunts than they were gaining from their catches. Silith the Threnody had not moved from her position by the waterhole in 2 full days. Her species could survive long periods without food, but even her legendary patience was being tested. A few small creatures had come to drink, but they had been too cautious, approaching from angles where she couldn't strike effectively. She had caught nothing since the first day. The Quilkson students had tried a new strategy, searching for nesting sites where eggs might be found. They had located 1 nest, but had been driven off by an aggressive parent bird that was larger and meaner than expected. One Quilkson, named Rix, had a deep gash across his wing membrane from the bird's talons by afternoon of day 3. Instructor Velkoth was genuinely concerned about his students' condition. The monitoring drone showed most of them exhausted, hungry, and struggling. Then he switched the view to Marcus's location, and his 4 eyes widened in surprise. The humans' camp looked nothing like it had 2 days ago. A smoking rack held up strips of meat from at least a dozen different animals. More meat lay drying on rocks in the sun. Several cleaned carcasses hung from a makeshift rack, protected from insects by smoke, and Marcus himself sat calmly in the shade, using a sharp stone to scrape a hide clean. How? Velkoth muttered. He rewound the drone footage, watching Marcus's activities over the past 3 days in accelerated time, he saw the human building strange contraptions. Along game trails and near water sources, he saw Marcus checking these devices periodically and collecting prey from them. Passive acquisition. Velkoth whispered, recognition dawning. He's not hunting, he's trapping. The instructor felt a strange mix of emotions in his 80 years of experience. He had never taught trapping because no species in the academy had used such methods for millennia. Most advanced species had moved past such primitive techniques when they developed technology. Active hunting was more prestigious, more aligned with how apex predators saw themselves. But as Velkoth watched Marcus efficiently process his abundant catch, he had to admit the effectiveness of the humans' approach. Marcus had achieved in 3 days what most students were failing to do despite their superior physical abilities. The instructor made a decision. He would not intervene unless students were in actual danger, but he would observe the human very carefully. Marcus spent the afternoon expanding his trap network. He built 3 more snares along trails he had identified through careful observation of animal movements. He constructed another fish weir in a different part of the stream. He even created a primitive spring trap that would launch a sharpened stick at any animal that triggered it, though he positioned this one very carefully and marked it extensively so he wouldn't trigger it himself by evening. Marcus had an operating network of nearly 20 traps spread across several square kilometers of terrain. Each trap worked independently, catching prey whether Marcus was present or not. That night, while other students struggled to hunt in the darkness or when hungry, Marcus ate smoked fish and roasted razor hair. He had so much food that he actually had to ration himself to avoid waste. The next morning brought day 4. And Marcus's first trap check yielded astonishing results. 3 razor hairs in various snares, 5 spine rats in box traps, a feathered drake in another deadfall trap, 11 fish in his weirs, 2 small reptilian creatures in snares he had set near rock crevices. Marcus stared at the pile of prey and realized he had a problem. He had far more food than he could possibly preserve or consume. It seemed wasteful to let these animals die for nothing. He thought about his classmates scattered across the barrens and made a decision using the non-emergency channel on his beacon. Marcus sent a signal to Instructor Velkoth, the monitoring station. Velkoth nearly fell from his seat when he saw the incoming transmission. First thought was that something had gone wrong, but the channel indicated it wasn't an emergency. Human Marcus reporting, Instructor. The message came through. I have secured significantly more food resources than required for the examination, and I would like permission to invite other students to share in the surplus. Is this acceptable within the rules? Velkoth sat back, stunned in all his decades of teaching. No student had ever made such a request. The rules didn't prohibit it. He had said students could use any strategy they wished, but sharing food with competitors? Permission granted, Velkoth replied, his curiosity overwhelming any concerns. You may contact other students via their beacon non-emergency channels. Marcus smiled and began composing a simple message. Have surplus food resources. He transmitted to all student beacons. All students welcome at my camp for meal coordinates. Attached, no obligations or trade required. Across the Crimson Barrens, 23 alien students received this message with reactions ranging from confusion to disbelief. Thrak discussed it with his packmates. Suspicious of some trick, Silith read it 3 times. Unable to process why the weakest student would invite competition to share resources. The Quilson students clicked excitedly. They were desperately hungry and didn't care about pride. One by one, students began making their way toward Marcus's coordinates. They were skeptical, exhausted, and hungry. What they found when they arrived would change their understanding of survival and of humans forever. The Quilkson students arrived first, gliding down from the sky with their wings spread wide to catch the thermal currents rising from the sun-baked rocks. Rix landed, awkwardly due to his injured wing, and all three of them stared at Marcus's camp with expressions of complete disbelief. The smoking rack was full of meat-drying racks held strips of jerky fresh catches hung from wooden FRAM is a small pile of clean fish lay near the water source, still cool from the stream. Is this real? Zrix asked, his voice barely a whisper in the standard language. Marcus looked up from where he was tending the fire and smiled. It's real, help yourselves. There's plenty. The Quilkson students approached cautiously, as if expecting a trap. But hunger overcame their skepticism. They took portions of smoked meat and began eating with desperate intensity within an hour. More students began arriving. Two of Throk's packmates came first, leaving Throk himself behind out of stubborn pride. Then Silith slithered into camp, her scales dusty from crossing the hot rocks, her movements showing the weakness of days without adequate food. A lone student from a species Marcus didn't recognize something, like a bipedal lizard with crystalline scales, limped in with obvious exhaustion by mid-afternoon. 18 of the 24 students had made their way to Marcus's camp. Only Throk and 4 others remained absent, either too proud to accept help or too far away to make the journey Marcus had prepared for their arrival. He had built a proper cooking fire with flat stones arranged to create a grill. Surface he roasted whole razor hairs and feathered drakes, seasoned with herbs he had identified from his botanical surveys. He made a simple soup by boiling fish with edible roots and plants in a makeshift container fashioned from a large piece of bark sealed with clay from the stream bed. The alien students sat around the fire in a loose circle, eating with an intensity that spoke of their desperate hunger. Some ate slowly, savoring food they hadn't been sure they would find. Others devoured portions quickly and then sat back looking embarrassed at their own desperation. I don't understand, Silith said finally, her voice hoarse from dehydration despite the water she had been drinking. How did you catch all of this? I didn't catch it in the traditional sense, Marcus replied, turning a spit that held a roasting feathered drake. I built traps that caught it for me. Traps? One of the Varkish asked, confused. What are traps? Marcus realized that the concept might be entirely foreign to species who had evolved past such techniques. Millennia ago. Let me show you, he said. Standing up, he led the group to the nearest snare, pointing out the bent branch, the trigger mechanism, and the loop of cordage. Animals use the same paths repeatedly because those paths are the easiest routes through terrain, Marcus explained. If you watch long enough, you can identify these paths. We call them game trails. He demonstrated how the trigger worked, showing how any pressure on the carefully balanced sticks would release the bent branch and tighten the snare. The animal walks into the loop. The trap triggers and the snare catches them, Marcus continued. It works while I sleep, while I eat. While I'm building other traps, it multiplies my effectiveness by working constantly without requiring my energy. The students stared at the simple mechanism with growing amazement. This is primitive, Zrik said, but there was wonder in his voice rather than dismissal. Our species abandoned such methods thousands of years ago. So did most human cultures, Marcus admitted. But we never completely stopped using them. Hunting and survival skills remained important in human culture for sport, for tradition, for emergency preparedness. He led them to the fish weir in the stream, showing how the funnel shape exploited the fish's behavior patterns. Fish swim forward naturally, Marcus explained. They follow water currents and swim upstream to spawn. The weir uses this behavior against them, and they swim right in without me having to catch each one individually. At the deadfall trap, Marcus demonstrated the trigger mechanism, though he was careful not to actually set it off. This uses gravity and leverage, he said. I position the rock, I set up the trigger, and then the trap does the work. All I had to do was understand how to build it. Silith moved closer to examine the deadfall. Her heat-sensing pits focused on the mechanism. Your people retained this knowledge, she said slowly, while mine evolved to rely entirely on our natural hunting abilities. When those abilities proved insufficient here, we had no alternative strategies. Exactly, Marcus nodded. My species learned early that we couldn't outrun, outfight, or outsense most prey. So we learned to think differently. We learned persistence, planning, and tool use. One of the Varkesh students, a female named Kira, spoke up. Could you teach us to build these traps? Marcus smiled. That's why I invited you all here, for the rest of the afternoon. Marcus led practical demonstrations. He showed them how to identify gain trails by looking for tracks, droppings, and disturbed vegetation. He taught them to read animal behavior from environmental signs, where they fed, where they sheltered, where they had to travel for water. He demonstrated how to test branch flexibility to find one suitable for snare springs, showed them how to create cordage from plant fibers by stripping and twisting them. The alien students, who had all been trained in various hunting techniques by Instructor Velkoth, found themselves learning entirely new concepts for species who hunted by speed, strength, or stealth. The idea of creating systems that worked independently was revolutionary. This is engineering, the crystalline-scaled student observed. You're not just hunting. You're designing mechanical solutions to biological problems. I never thought of it that way, Marcus admitted. But yes, I suppose that's accurate. As evening approached and the heat began to fade from the day, the students sat around the fire again. This time with full bellies and new knowledges. Rix spoke what many were thinking. We pitied you when we saw you had no natural advantages, he said to Marcus. We thought you would fail because you were weak compared to us. I understand, Marcus said without resentment. From your perspective, humans do seem disadvantaged, but you're not weak, Kira said firmly. You're different. Your strength is in your mind, in your ability to create solutions we never imagined. Silith uncoiled slightly, a sign of relaxation in her species. How long have humans used these trapping methods? Archaeological evidence suggests at least 40,000 years, Marcus replied. Maybe longer, and we never stopped. Even after we developed advanced technology, the number stunned them into silence. 40,000 years of refined technique, passed down through countless generations while other species had abandoned such methods as primitive once they achieved space travel. Humans had maintained them as cultural knowledge. Why? Zrix asked. Why keep using primitive methods when you had better technology? Marcus considered the question. I think because we remembered that circumstances can change, technology can fail. Environments can be harsh, and the old skills remain reliable. And maybe because there's satisfaction in being self-sufficient, in knowing you can survive with nothing but your knowledge and your hands. He poked the fire, sending sparks upward into the darkening sky. Every human child learns to tie knots, to start fires, to navigate by the sun and stars. We teach things not because we'll necessarily need them, but because they connect us to our ancestors and remind us of our adaptability in the monitoring station. Instructor Velkoth had watched the entire afternoon through the orbital drones, had seen Marcus teaching the ancient methods to students who represented the pinnacle of evolved predatory species. He had watched those students who had struggled and starved, using their natural advantages, learn to think in ways their species had forgotten. The old instructor sat back in his chair, mandibles clicking in what his species used to express deep thought. I have been teaching survival wrong, he said aloud to the empty room. I taught them to be predators, but the human teaches them to be survivors. There is a difference. As night fell over the Crimson Barrens, 18 students slept in Marcus's camp with full stomachs and new understanding. They would return to their own zones in the morning to complete the examination, but they would return changed, and somewhere in the darkness, Throck sat alone, his pride warring with his hunger, wondering if he had made a mistake in refusing to learn from the weak human who somehow thrived where stronger beings struggled. The fifth and final day of the examination dawned with a coolness that suggested seasonal change was coming to the Crimson Barrens, and the students began their journeys back to the Academy landing zone. Marcus made one final check of his trap lines, carefully dismantling each one and scattering the materials so they would decompose naturally and not harm wildlife after he left. He loaded his pack with preserved food, far more than required to prove he had sustained himself through the trial. The other students who had visited his camp returned to their own zones to collect whatever meager supplies they had managed to acquire before accepting his invitation. Most carried memories and knowledge worth more than any amount of food. The transport ships began their pickup runs at midday, collecting exhausted students from across the Barrens and returning them to the Academy in the debriefing facility. Students were weighed, examined medically, and required to present the food they had acquired as proof of their survival. Ishishrock was among the first to arrive, and he looked terrible. His fur was matted with dirt and dried blood from dozens of small cuts. His pack had managed to catch just barely enough food to pass the examination, but at enormous physical cost. Grax still limped from his injured paw, and all three Varkish had lost significant body mass when they placed their meager collection of dried meat on the examination table. Instructor Velkoth nodded gravely. "You pass, but barely. You expended more energy than you gained in most of your hunts, and only your species' considerable reserves kept you alive." Throck wanted to argue but couldn't. The instructor was right. Silith arrived next. Her movements slow and weak, she had finally caught prey on the fourth day using techniques Marcus had suggested about positioning herself where trails converged rather than at the water source itself. She presented two small animals, just enough to meet the minimum requirement. "You pass," Velkoth said, "but your traditional ambush methods proved inefficient in this terrain. You survived through patience alone, not through adaptation." The Quilkson students arrived together, chattering excitedly. They presented a respectable quantity of preserved meat and fish, and when Velkoth asked how they had acquired so much in such a short time, they explained enthusiastically about the traps they had built after learning from Marcus. "We constructed snares and box traps in our own zones," Zrix explained, his injured wing now bandaged. "We caught more in one night of trapping than in 3 days of active hunting." Velkoth made notes but said nothing yet. Other students arrived with similar stories. They had struggled initially, learned from Marcus, and then applied those techniques with varying degrees of success. Some had mastered the concepts quickly and built effective traps. Others had tried but lacked the fine motor control or spatial reasoning to construct working mechanisms. All of them had gained something from the experience. Finally, Marcus arrived. He looked remarkably healthy compared to his classmates, not exhausted, not injured, not malnourished. He placed his pack on the examination table and began removing its contents: smoked meat, dried fish, jerky, preserved organs, cleaned hides, and even a small collection of useful plants he had harvested. The sheer quantity was staggering, enough food to have sustained him for 3 weeks rather than 5 days. Velkoth stared at the abundance, then looked at Marcus with an expression the human couldn't quite read. "You pass," the instructor said quietly. "Wait in the assembly hall. I will speak with all students shortly." Marcus nodded and left the debriefing room an hour later. When all students had been processed and cleared medically, Velkoth called them to the main assembly hall. The 24 students gathered, some sitting, some standing, according to their species preferences. Marcus found himself surrounded by the students who had visited his camp, while Throck and his pack sat alone on the opposite side of the halve. Velkoth entered and moved to the front of the room, his forearms clasped behind his back in a posture that suggested deep contemplation. "I have been teaching survival skills for 80 years, he began, his voice carrying easily through the space. "I have trained thousands of students from hundreds of species, and I believed I understood the principles of survival in hostile environments." He paused, his compound eyes scanning the assembled students. "I was wrong," he continued, "or at least, I was incomplete in my understanding." This admission from the legendary instructor caused shocked murmurs throughout the hall. "I taught you to hunt like predators," Velkoth said. "I focused on helping each species maximize their natural advantages: speed, strength, senses, venom, natural weapons, because that is how apex predators have survived throughout evolutionary history." He gestured toward Throck and the other students who had relied purely on traditional methods. "And many of you succeeded using these techniques. But you succeeded at great cost. You expended enormous energy, sustained injuries, and barely met the minimum requirements." Then Velkoth turned toward Marcus. The one student took a completely different approach, an approach I had never taught because I considered it primitive and outdated. Marcus felt dozens of alien eyes focusing on him. "The human built traps," Velkoth stated, and in doing so, demonstrated something I failed to teach: the difference between hunting and thriving. The instructor began pacing, his forearms gesturing as he spoke. "Every species in this room evolved from apex predators. You hunted, you killed, you survived. And then you developed technology that made hunting unnecessary for survival. And you abandoned the old ways." He stopped and faced them directly. "Humans are the only species in the galactic community who never stopped practicing primitive survival techniques, not because they needed them, but because they valued them." Velkoth activated a holographic display showing footage from the examination. The students watched Marcus building his first trap, then his second, then checking them and finding prey. They saw him teaching others, sharing his abundance, creating systems that worked without his constant presence. "This is what I failed to teach you," Velkoth said. "Humans survived not by being the fastest or strongest predators on their world. They were neither. They survived by being the most adaptable, by creating solutions to problems, by thinking in terms of systems and leverage rather than direct confrontation." Silith raised a hand. "Instructor, are you saying our species' evolutionary advantages are inferior to human thinking?" "No," Velkoth replied. "I'm saying they are different. And that diversity of approach has value. Your species can kill quickly and efficiently when prey presents itself. But the human-ensured prey would present itself through careful planning." He gestured at the display showing Marcus's trap network. "Humans call this working smarter, not harder." They understood that their physical limitations meant they needed to maximize efficiency. Throck spoke up, his voice rough with emotion. "Are you saying I failed because I relied on my natural abilities?" Velkoth considered this carefully. "You passed the examination, but you barely survived. If the trial had lasted another 3 days, you would have starved despite being one of the most formidable predators in this room. And that should concern you." The instructor moved to stand beside Marcus. This human achieved abundance while others struggled for bare subsistence, not through superior strength or speed, but through retained ancestral knowledge and adaptive thinking. He addressed the entire assembly. "Beginning next term, the Academy will offer a new course, Adaptive Survival Strategies, Primitive Human Methods. It will cover trap construction, passive acquisition techniques, persistence hunting, tool creation, and systems thinking." Excited murmurs spread through the hall, but more importantly, Velkoth continued, his voice rising to ensure he was heard. I want you all to understand the broader lesson here. Intelligence is not about having the most advanced technology, and survival is not about having the most impressive natural weapons. He placed one of his 4 hands on Marcus's shoulder. True intelligence is retaining and adapting knowledge across generations, regardless of whether that knowledge seems primitive or advanced. And true survival skills are about creating sustainable systems, rather than relying solely on individual prowess. Velkoth turned to look at Marcus directly. Human Marcus, you achieved the highest score in Academy history, not just for the quantity of food you acquired, but for demonstrating principles of efficiency, sustainability, and cooperation that I should have been teaching all along. Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment at the praise. I just used what my father taught me, sir. He loved camping and survival skills. And that, Velkoth said firmly, is precisely the point. Your species maintains these skills through cultural transmission, teaching them even when they seem unnecessary, because you understand that knowledge itself has value. The instructor addressed the full assembly again. You are dismissed. But I encourage all of you to speak with Marcus, to ask questions. To learn from his approach, you may find that combining your species' natural advantages with human adaptive strategies makes you far more capable than either approach alone. As the students began to file out, many approached Marcus with questions and requests for further instruction. Even Throck, after a long moment of internal struggle, crossed the hall and stood before the human. I was wrong to dismiss you, the massive Vokesh said, his voice stiff with the difficulty of admitting error. I would like to learn your techniques, if